Irana woke before dawn on the dusty market planet. The sky was still dark, but the first pale light crept over the horizon. She lay on the cold stone floor of her cage, her metal collar heavy around her neck. The link of chain rattled softly. As she moved, the chain stretched across the ground and tied to a thick post driven deep into the rock. She could not rise fully. Pain throbbed in her shoulder where the metal bit into her skin. Around her, other cages held creatures from distant worlds. They made strange sounds in the early morning stillness. A soft breeze carried the smell of spices, sweat, and rusted metal. Traders in heavy cloaks began to arrive, led by armed guards with blasters at their hips. Irana watched with calm eyes. She knew familiar danger lay ahead, but she also had practiced patience. The market world had its own rules: sell or be sold. The strongest thrived, and the weak served. Irana had been brought here years ago. She still remembered her home's bright skies and gentle winds. She remembered her mother singing lullabies under a pale blue sun. She remembered children running in fields of tall grass. Those memories were faint, like stars seen through a thick haze. Still, they lived inside her heart. She hummed a soft tune as the first traders approached. The tune was an old lullaby from her home, the same one her mother sang. Her voice was low and nearly silent. She traced patterns in the sand with the tip of her finger. The swirl of lines reminded her of the ancient symbols her people used to carve on stone tablets. She closed her eyes and let the memories flow. Each note of the song shaped the patterns, and for a moment she felt free. The guards came close. One of them, a tall figure wrapped in dark cloth, lifted her chin with a rough hand. He studied her collar lock, its edges bitten by rust and worn by neglect. He grunted and spat on the ground. "Worthless," he muttered. He hit the side of her cage with a heavy boot. Steel bars vibrated. Irana opened her eyes. She stared back without fear. The guards had beaten many who shrank and pleaded. She did neither. She stood slowly, fingers brushing the bars, chain rattling. Other buyers joined the man. They whispered and pointed. One held up a data pad showing credit numbers and trade goods. They talked of profit, never of her life. A woman in fine robes laughed at a low price. Another trader in metal armor called out, "Enough talk? Let's move her to the sale pens." The crowd shifted as if on command. The guards unhooked the chain from its post and dragged Irana's cage toward a larger enclosure. Irana's heart beat slowly. She closed her eyes again and felt the rough floor's cold surface beneath her palms. She remembered a promise she had made to herself long ago: never let them break her spirit. Her small acts of defiance, singing, drawing patterns, were all that remained of her dignity. She would hold on to them. They were her treasure. As the market sun rose, it cast long shadows through the iron bars. Traders brought their wares into the open, and Irana saw glittering fabrics, strange fruits, and curious machines. She wondered how it would feel to touch soft cloth again, or taste a fruit whose juice ran cool and sweet across her tongue. Hunger and thirst panged her body, but she refused to beg. She had learned to wait for kindness. The sale pens lay beyond. Rows of cages and stalls. Here, the air was thicker with heat. The ground was bare dirt trampled by years of feet. Irana's cage was placed between two others. A harsh voice called out from a raised platform. A figure in polished armor looked down. Next up, the voice boomed. Guards unlocked the front gate of Irana's cage. It swung open with a squeal. Of metal, she did not step out. She remained on all fours as she had been trained. The buyers laughed and jeered. They called her names in languages she did not understand. One man approached with a whip. He cracked it in the air, its tail humming. The sharp sound made Irana's chest tighten. She did not flinch. Her eyes stayed steady. People had praised her spirit once, in a time before chains. The man snapped the whip again. It cut the air closer. She lifted her head. She refused to show pain. A hush fell over the crowd. They expected her to cry out. When she did not, one trader said, "She Must be hardened. The laughter died. They lowered their voices and backed away. The man with the whip shrugged and threw it aside. Next. They led away one buyer after another. At last, someone paid the price. Credits exchanged hands. A guard unlocked her collar lock. Dial turns clanked. Irana felt the lock give way. For a moment, she was free of the weight. Her muscles trembled. She did not stand. She did not run. She just felt the metal fall away. She pressed her palm to her neck, where the cold metal had pressed for years. Her skin was rough, scarred by constant rubbing. She closed her eyes and pressed her cheek to the bar. She let herself feel. The day grew hotter. Traders left to seek shade. The guards cleaned their weapons. The crowd thinned. Irana's gaze drifted upward to the sky. She saw a single silver star refracted in the morning light. She remembered her song. She began to hum again. The soft melody rose above the market noise. It was her voice. It was her power. In that moment, hope flickered more brightly than the harsh sun. She did not know when or how freedom would come. She did not know who would help her. But in the echo of her own song, she felt a promise. She felt the strength to stay alive. She would remember the lullaby. She would trace patterns. In dust and sand, she would wait for the kindness that could change everything. Ask ChatGPT. Captain Dylan Cross stepped onto the bustling plaza just after sunrise. Dust swirled in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of spices and oil. Traders in colorful robes shouted their wares, and armored guards paced the corridors. Dylan drew a slow breath. He had landed on this harsh world to restock his ship and continue his journey. He had heard tales of cruelty here, but had not expected to see much beyond crowded stalls and noisy crowds. As he neared the cages, he noticed a small group gathering by one pen. He paused, curious. The metal bars held creatures of many shapes and sizes. Most buyers ignored the captives, too focused on profit. But Dylan's steady gaze fell on one cage where an alien woman knelt on all fours. Her skin was a pale green, marked with faint tribal patterns. The heavy metal collar around her neck clinked softly as she shifted. Dylan's heart tightened. He had seen suffering before, but something in the woman's eyes stopped him. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. In that instant, he saw more than a captive. He saw a life unjustly bound. Traders nearby laughed and whispered about the low starting price. A slaver snapped the woman's collar with a sharp tug. She winced but held her posture, refusing to cry out. Dylan moved closer. He studied the slaver, a bulky man in patchwork, armor with a blaster holstered at his side. The man flipped through a datapad showing credits and barter items. Dylan considered his own credit pouch. He had enough to pay for the supplies he needed, and perhaps more. He wondered what it would cost to buy the woman's freedom. But his mind raced. Was he foolish to intervene? He straightened his jacket and stepped forward. The crowd shifted, clearing a small path. Dylan approached the slaver and offered a polite bow. "Good morning," he said in a calm tone. The slaver looked up, surprised. "I'm Captain Dylan Cross," Dylan continued. "I need supplies and repairs, but I see you have this one for sale." He gestured to the woman. The slaver narrowed his eyes. "Interested in slaves, are you?" he sneered. "Keep good." Stock Dylan raised his hands. "I'm not interested in owning her. I'm interested in her life." "What is her cost?" The slaver laughed. "Cost? She's worth less than a crate of spice. 500 credits. Dylan's jaw tightened. 500 credits could buy him a week's worth of repairs and fuel. He weighed his options. He felt the woman's eyes on him, silent and pleading. 500 credits, Dylan repeated, pulling a small stack of credits from a pouch. He laid them on the slaver's counter. "Here." The slaver collected the credits and nodded. "She's yours." Guards unlocked the cage and stepped back. Dylan reached inside and unfastened the woman's collar. It fell away with a clatter. The chain lay loose on the ground. Dylan held it up, then dropped it. He offered his hand to the woman. For a long moment she did not move. Her muscles trembled. She stared at the open cage door. The crowd watched in silence. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet. Her joints ached from years on all fours. She flexed her fingers, testing her strength. Dylan spoke softly. "You are free." She looked at him, blinking. She did not speak the same language, but her gratitude shone in her eyes. Dylan gestured toward the ship docked nearby. "I can help you," he said. She hesitated, glancing at the guards who had already returned to their posts. The world beyond the plaza seemed vast and frightening. Dylan stepped forward and gently guided her by the shoulder. She allowed him, as if trusting his kindness outweighed her fear. Together they walked past the stalls, where traders stared in disbelief. A trader in fine robes spat on the ground. "Traitor to your kind," he muttered. Dylan ignored him. Led the woman to a shaded alcove where a mechanic and 2 crew members waited. The mechanic, a wiry woman named Zara, knelt to examine the fallen collar. She shook her head. "This lock is weak," she said. "But these chains are rigged to an alarm. They would have raised the guards." Dylan frowned. "Then we're lucky they did not hear." Zara smiled. "Lucky indeed." She rose and offered the woman a water flask. The woman drank greedily, her throat dry. Dylan watched with relief. He said to his crew, "We must get her off this world soon. Repairs can wait." His crew nodded. The pilot, a tall man named Ken, adjusted his headset. "We finish loading the spice and depart within the hour." Dylan turned back to the woman. She looked at him, confused by the sudden change. Her hands traced the rim of the water flask. She drank again, slower this time, her eyes softening. Dylan realized she needed more than freedom. He lowered himself to sit beside her, pointed to himself, and said, "Dylan?" She paused, then pointed to herself and whispered a single word. "Irana." Dylan nodded. "Yes, Irana." He smiled gently. His voice was calm without command. Irana looked at him with curiosity. She touched her throat where the collar had burned her skin. Dylan placed a hand on his heart and bowed his head. She mirrored his gesture, pressing her palm to her chest. Understanding passed between them. Kindness needed no words. Irana rose unsteadily. She tested her legs and stretched her back. Dylan watched as she took her first full steps in years. Each footfall was a victory. He offered his arm, and she accepted. Together, they walked across the plaza toward the ship. Guards raised blasters, but held fire. Ken fired a warning shot into the air. The crowd scattered. Dylan and Irana climbed the ramp into the ship's cargo hold. Inside, the cool air and soft lights welcomed them. Zara set down the collar on a workbench. Ken closed the ramp and engaged the magnetic seals. Dylan placed a hand on Irana's shoulder. She looked up at him. He smiled and said, "You are safe now." Irana closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. Tears traced lines down her dusty cheeks. Dylan watched her with a quiet satisfaction. He had risked his credits and his reputation, but he knew it was right. He thought of his promise to stand up for those who had no voice. Irana had no words for thanks, but her gratitude filled the hold. Dylan knew her journey to healing would be long. He would give her time. He would give her respect. As the engines rumbled and the ship lifted off, Irana pressed her forehead to the glass viewport. The dusty world faded below. She watched the market plaza shrink to a tiny dot. She felt something new inside her hope. Dylan stood beside her, silent but supportive. He knew the road ahead would hold challenges. But he also knew that every soul deserved kindness and freedom. Ira turned to him and smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. Dylan returned the smile. In that moment, 2 lives touched by cruelty and compassion joined together. Her journey had begun. Irana awoke to the gentle hum of engines. The ship drifted through space, stars sliding past the viewports like silent travelers. She lay on a soft cot in the med bay, her body warm and safe for the first time in years. A pale light from overhead panels eased the stiffness in her joints. She flexed her fingers and felt strength return. Small but steady Captain Dylan Cross stood at the door, leaning against the frame. He watched Irana with a calm expression. When she opened her eyes, He offered a small nod. She remembered the first day he freed her, how he bought her life with credits and kindness. Now she saw his face not as a stranger, but as a friend. She tried to smile, but the movement hurt her cheek muscles. Dylan caught her gaze and pointed to a glass of water. On a nearby tray, she reached for it, her hand unsteady, and drank deeply. The medic Zara bustled in and checked Irana's pulse. She spoke in a soft tone, neither harsh nor too gentle. "Your body needs rest," she said, writing a note on a holopad. Irana did not understand all the words, but her voice was kind. Zara pressed a cool patch to the scars on Irana's neck. "This will help the pain." Irana closed her eyes and breathed in the faint scent of antiseptic and clean linen. After a moment, Dylan spoke. "We will reach the free colony in 12 hours. Irana blinked. Free colony, that meant a place where she could be safe and learn a new life. She tried to stand, but her legs shook. Dylan stepped forward and held out his hand. She took it, and he helped her onto her feet. Each step was slow, but Irana felt hope rise in her chest. They walked down the corridor of the ship. The walls glowed with soft lights. Ship creaked as it moved. Irana's senses took in every sound, the whir of cooling fans, the hiss of air vents, the distant voice of the pilot Ken calling to his console. She touched the rail beside her, tracing the smooth metal. Felt like a lifeline guiding her toward something new. In the cargo hold, Zara arranged supplies. Crates of food, medkits, and spare parts filled the space. She greeted Irana with a smile. Irana bent to help, stacking small boxes. The rhythm of work soothed her mind. Dylan and Ken watched, exchanging quiet words. Irana learned by doing. She placed each crate carefully, her movements precise. The crew accepted her help without question. For the first time, she felt useful. Later in the ship's galley, Irana sat at a table. Dylan slid a bowl of warm soup in front of her. Steam rose in soft spirals. Irana inhaled the scent of vegetables and broth. She raised the spoon to her lips. The taste surprised her. Gentle, nourishing, alive. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. Dylan watched her with relief. He knew hunger had been her constant companion while she lived in chains. Between bites, Irana reached out and touched the table's surface. She traced the grain pattern, imagining fields on her home world. Then she looked at Dylan and tapped her chest twice, a simple way to say thank you. Dylan nodded, understanding the gesture. No words were needed. After the meal, Dylan guided Irana to a small lounge. Cushions lay on the floor beside a low table covered with data pads and star charts. Ken entered and pointed to a chart. Stars blinked in colored dots. Dylan tapped one and said, "This is the free colony." He moved his finger to a distant point. "We will arrive here." Irana watched, her brow furrowed. She did not speak his language well, but she understood the promise. A safe place. As they talked, a sudden alarm sounded. Red lights pulsed along the walls. Ken's voice crackled over the speaker. "Impact detected. Small meteor debris. Shields holding, but need manual override." Dylan grabbed Irana's arm. "Stay here," he said. Determination in her eyes. She pointed to herself and tapped her chest. "Irana, help." Dylan hesitated, then nodded. He handed her a toolless small wrench. Together, they ran down a narrow hallway toward the engineering bay. The corridor pitch dark, except for flickering emergency lights. Sparks rained from a damaged conduit. Insulation hung like torn cloth. A valve panel glowed red where systems had shut down. Ken and Zara worked at the console, alarms blaring. Irana stepped forward, gripping the wrench. Zara pointed to a broken pipe and mimed turning a valve. Irana understood. She knelt and fitted the wrench to the valve stem. Her fingers shook, but she pressed down and turned. The pipe hissed and sealed. The alarm tone changed from urgent to steady. Ken tapped commands into the console. Shields hummed back to full strength. Lights returned to normal. The ship gave a relieved sigh as if it too felt the danger pass. Dylan placed a hand on Irana's shoulder. She looked up at him, chest heaving. He smiled and said, Well done. Irana did not know the words for pride, but she felt it warm her heart. They returned to the lounge, adrenaline fading. Irana sank onto a cushion, exhaustion washing over her. Oh, Dylan sat beside her. He produced a small holopad and tapped a message. Symbols and lines, no words. He showed it to Irana. Ah! She traced the shapes with wonder. It was a map of the ship and star routes. He pointed to one route and nodded. Irana tapped her finger on the map, then on herself, then on Dylan. She was learning fast. That night, the ship slid into orbit around the Free Colony's moon. Lights from the settlement twinkled below like jewels scattered on velvet. Irana stood at the viewport, pressing her forehead to the glass. Dylan joined. Her, silent. They watched the world below. Domed habitats, spindly towers, green patches of hydroponic farms. A wind of possibility brushed past Irana's heart. She felt tears come to her eyes, but these tears were not of pain. They were of relief and wonder. Dylan placed a gentle hand on her back. She turned and met his eyes. She pointed to the world. Below, then to her heart, and finally to Dylan. He smiled and bowed his head. In that simple gesture, they spoke more than words ever could. Irana knew she belonged here now, among people who saw her as a person, not property. She felt safe, and for the first time, she believed her life could be more than survival. As the ship prepared to descend, Dylan whispered, "Welcome home, Irana." She smiled and whispered back in her language, a soft word that meant thank. You, below them, the Free Colony's lights shone like a promise. Irana felt her spirit rise, ready to face a new world. Irana stepped off the ship onto the soft metal landing pad. The hatch closed behind her with a gentle hiss. She held Dylan's hand as they walked into the processing hall. Lights glowed softly overhead and walls curved like gentle waves. A tall figure in simple white robes greeted them. The figure bowed and said, "Welcome to Aurora Haven." Irana did not know the words, but she felt warmth in the gesture. She breathed deeply and smelled clean air mixed with faint green scents of hydroponic gardens beyond. Dylan smiled and squeezed her hand. Together they moved toward the decontamination. Arched inside the arch, gentle mist fell like dew. Irana closed her eyes as droplets touched her skin. She felt the weight of dust and fear wash away. Guards on the station watched without weapons, simply observing. A technician handed Irana a soft robe and simple sandals. She slipped them on and felt their comfort. Dylan donned his own clothes again, trading dusty boots for smooth soles. They stepped into a wide corridor lined with arched windows. The glass Irana saw rows of gardens lit by bright lamps. Green vines curled around metal supports and water, dripped into clear trays below. They reached a central chamber where others waited. Some were human, some came from distant worlds. Each had once been a captive somewhere. They smiled at Irana, nodding in greeting. A gentle hum filled the room as a doctor named Maria approached. She knelt beside Irana and examined her hands. In soft tones, Maria spoke words of healing. Irana felt cool gel on her scars and warmth in her heart. Maria pressed a bandage gently to a cut on Irana's wrist. "You are safe now," Maria said, her voice calm. Irana pressed a palm to her heart and whispered her name, Irana. Maria repeated it and smiled. After the health check, Dylan led Irana to a small living quarter. Sunlight spilled through a round window onto a simple bed with soft blankets. A wooden table held a small vase of fresh flowers. Irana ran her fingers over the petals, marveling at their softness. She had not felt living things so close in years. Dylan pointed to a stack of books on the table. One had pictures of stars and planets. Irana opened it and saw colorful images. She touched a painting of her home world, a field of tall grass. Beneath a blue sky, tears gathered in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. The next morning, Irana woke to birdsong. A small robotic bird perched outside her window, its wings flashing tiny lights. She dressed quickly in simple trousers and a tunic provided by the colony. Dylan waited in the hallway. Together they walked toward the hydroponic gardens. Water glistened on leaves of strange fruits, bright red berries, blue pods, and golden flowers. Irana plucked a berry and bit into it. The juice was sweet and cool. She closed her eyes and savored the taste. A gardener named Liam offered her more fruit. He spoke softly. First harvest of the season. Irana smiled and nodded. In the education wing, Irana joined a small group around a low table. A teacher named Celine held a slate and chalk. When she wrote simple symbols and sounds, Irana traced each shape with her finger. Dylan sat nearby, helping translate when Irana paused. She learned words for home, friend, and freedom. Each word filled her with pride. A child named Mira sat next to Irana. Mira's eyes were bright and curious. She pointed to Irana's hand and asked a question. Irana laughed softly and guided Mira's hand to her own. They learned together, drawing their names side by side on the slate. By midday, Irana joined Zara in the communal kitchen. Together they peeled vegetables and mixed spices. Zara taught Irana to cook simple stew in a large pot over a gentle flame. Irana stirred with care, breathing in the smell of onions and herbs. When the stew was ready, she ladled it into bowls and served it to others. People thanked her with nods and smiles. Irana felt a warm glow. She had given instead of begging. She had helped instead of hiding. As afternoon light deepened, Dylan invited Irana to the observation deck. They climbed a spiral staircase and emerged onto an open balcony. Beneath them lay the colony's dome, a shining bubble in the desert. 2 moons hung in the sky, pale and calm. Irana leaned on the railing and watched the moons drift. She remembered her own sky, with its single sun. She reached for Dylan's hand. Without words, she said thank you again. Dylan wrapped an arm around her shoulder and pointed to a distant ridge. We will explore that tomorrow, he said. Irana's heart leaped at the promise of adventure. Suddenly a tone sounded in the deck's speakers. A voice called, "Emergency beacon activated." From Sector 5. Dylan frowned and touched a control panel. A hologram shimmered into view. A small icon pulsed at the edge of the map. Irana recognized the marker. It was the market world where she had been chained. Her heart clenched. Dylan looked at her and asked, "Should we help?" Irana's hand tightened around his. She thought of those still in chains, of voices unheard. She nodded firmly. Dylan spoke into his communicator. "Prepare for departure. We are going back." She'd come here to heal, but now she could give something back. She had learned kindness, freedom, and trust. Now she would bring it to others. As she and Dylan walked down the staircase, the moon shone brighter, guiding them on a new path. Irana felt her spirit soar. She was no longer a captive or a victim. She was a rescuer in the making, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Irana stood at the viewport as Aurora Haven faded behind. Dylan and Ken worked at the flight controls, setting course back to the slaver world. Zara checked the gear, lockpicks, simple tools, medkits. Liam loaded fresh water and food into small packs. Irana held a holopad with the layout of the cages. Her heart pounded, but she felt calm resolve. She knew this mission was dangerous, but she could not ignore those left in chains. The ship slid through space at steady speed. Stars moved past like silent watchers. Irana reviewed the plan with Dylan and Zara. They would drop in just above the trading post's roof and use a service hatch to slip inside. Once they reached the pens, they would free as many captives as they could carry. If alarms rang, Ken would extract them immediately. Irana practiced the signal she and Dylan had agreed on. 3 soft taps on the holopad. At each step, she repeated, to herself, kindness always finds a way. The Free Colony's defenses had taught them stealth. A small shuttle detached from the main ship and dropped toward the planet. Irana's palms were damp, but she gripped the rail firmly. The shuttle's engines flared, reducing speed. Charred clouds drifted below, stained by smoke from the marketplace. Soon, the shuttle hovered near a spire of broken metal. Dylan opened the hatch. Cool night air rushed in. They climbed out onto a narrow ledge. Irana watched the slaver world's lights glow dimly in the haze. Guards patrolled with slow steps, their blasters at rest. The group moved in single file, shadows among shadows. Zara led the way to a maintenance alcove. She worked quickly, slipping a slender tool into a panel. Circuits glowed, then clicked. A soft hiss signaled an open hatch. Dylan knocked once, twice. Rana held her breath until Zara whispered, "All clear." Inside the service tunnel, the hall was narrow and dark. Pipes dripped water in steady rhythm. Irana's chain of memory jingled in her pocket, a gift from the colony to remind her of home and hope. She fingered it lightly. Dylan guided her by the elbow. "Stay close," he murmured. Irana nodded. She followed his steps, her eyes adjusting. To the dim light, they reached a junction marked by a worn sign: animal pens. The steel door was heavy, but Zara wedged it open with a pry bar. Beyond lay a row of cages, each holding a creature in fear. Rana's heart clenched at the sight of battered bodies huddled on cold floors. Dylan tapped his pad twice. Before the first lock and picked it with swift fingers. Click. The door opened. A young alien with blue skin and wide eyes looked out. He dropped to the floor and covered his head. Rana knelt and spoke gently, using simple words and gestures. "Friend? Free. Come." The alien hesitated, then crawled forward. Dylan lifted him and set him outside the door. One by one, they repeated the process. Irana knelt at each cage, whispering her lullaby in a soft voice. Helping calm hearts filled with fear, as they neared Irana's old cell, her throat tightened. The cage looked smaller now. The collar and chain lay on the floor, mocked by the starlight filtering through vents. Zara worked the lock, hands steady. Click. The door swung open. Irana paused, then stepped inside. Memories crowded her mind. Pain, hunger, loneliness. She drew a deep breath and knelt beside a thin figure curled on the floor. Gently, she placed a hand on its shoulder and whispered, "Free." The figure uncurled, revealing a small woman with violet skin and trembling. Hands' tears glistened in her eyes. She looked at Irana, then at Dylan, and nodded. Irana offered her water and helped her stand. The woman held Irana's hand, stepping slowly but firmly. Irana felt a surge of joy. She and Dylan exchanged a look of shared triumph. Suddenly, alarms blared. Red lights flickered along the walls. A harsh voice crackled. "Intruders in the pens. Sound the alert." Dylan gripped his communicator. "Ken now?" he hissed. Irana rounded up the freed captives and guided them toward the service hatch. Some stumbled. Others followed quickly. Zara swept the last of the lockpicks into her pack. Steel doors slammed at the tunnel entrance. Guards shouted and ran toward the pens. Irana's chest pounded as she ran with the small group. The tunnel grew steep. Dylan led the way up a flight of stairs. Irana assisted the violet-skinned woman, supporting her under the arm. They reached the hatch. Ken's voice sounded above. 5 seconds. Zara slammed her hand on the release. The hatch swung open. Ken and Liam caught each captive and pulled them onto the shuttle's landing ramp. Irana helped guide the last. One through. Dylan turned and slipped inside himself, eyes scanning for stragglers. Irana counted heads quickly. "All here," she whispered. Behind them, the hatch sealed with a thud. The shuttle lifted off moments before guards burst through the door inside. Irana pressed her forehead to the wall, breathing hard. The freed captives huddled with wide eyes, some weeping, others staring. Dylan knelt beside Irana. "You led them well," he said softly. Irana shook her head. "We all did." She looked around at each face. Hope sparkled despite shock and fear. She offered her hand to the violet-skinned woman. The woman grasped it tightly and whispered a word that sounded like life. Ken engaged the engines and the shuttle shot upward. City lights shrank below. Irana watched through the viewport as the slaver world's sky faded to black. She thought of the cages she left behind and the lives changed forever. She pressed her hand to the glass. She felt both sorrow for the captives still out there and pride in the ones they saved. When the shuttle docked with the main ship, Irana walked down the ramp first. The freed captives were led to a secure module where they would rest and heal. Zara and Liam offered water and blankets. Dylan spoke words of comfort. Irana stayed close to the violet-skinned woman, learning that her name was Celia. Alia? Celia smiled and touched Irana's arm. Simple gesture, but it filled Irana with warmth. Later, Irana stood at the ship's rail, looking out at the stars. Dylan joined her and placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you." He shook his head. "Thank you for your courage." Irana smiled. She felt hope not only for herself, but for many others. She knew the fight against cruelty would continue, but she also knew that kindness could move worlds. As the ship jumped to hyperspace, Irana closed her eyes. She heard the soft hum of the engines and the quiet breaths of the freed captives nearby. She thought of her homeworld's tall grass and blue sky. One day, she would return. But for now, she would stand. With Dylan and the crew, bringing freedom to those who needed it most. And in her heart, she carried the lullaby that kept her spirit alive. The days following their escape were filled with activity. The ship, now a safe haven for the freed captives, glided through space, its crew working tirelessly to ensure that everyone was well cared for. Irana had become a quiet leader among the group. She moved with purpose, helping wherever she could. Dylan, always by her side, watched with pride as she took on more responsibility, guiding the others with kindness and patience. One afternoon, as the ship cruised toward a distant planet, Irana sat at the cruise table with Celia, the violet-skinned woman they had rescued. The others gathered around, and Zara, the medic, began teaching basic medical care. Irana listened closely, her focus sharp. She had learned quickly on the free colony, and now she was determined to share her knowledge with the others. Celia smiled at Irana, a silent thank you in her eyes. "You saved us," Celia said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Irana looked at her and placed a hand on Celia's. "You don't need to," she replied. "We're all free now. That's enough." As the days passed, the group formed bonds with one another. They shared their stories of suffering and survival, but also of hope. Many had once been slaves, but now they were free to chart their own paths. Dylan made sure everyone had a place on the ship, even assigning roles for each person. Some worked in the garden, others helped maintain the ship, and a few even assisted with navigation. Irana helped with the younger captives, teaching them to read, write, and speak the common tongue. Despite the progress, Irana couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in her heart. There were still too many like her, too many who were still chained and silenced. She spent hours gazing out into space, her mind filled with thoughts of the slaver world they had left behind. They had rescued only a small fraction of the captives. The thought of the others still trapped there haunted her. Dylan noticed her quiet moments and joined. Her one evening on the observation deck, stars outside glistened, the universe stretching endlessly before them. He stood beside her, his hand resting on the railing. "You're thinking about them, aren't you?" he asked softly. Irana nodded, her eyes distant. "There are so many left behind, so many still suffering." Her voice trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. "I feel like we've only scratched the surface. There are more out there." Dylan turned to her, his expression serious. "I know, but we've made a difference. Those we saved," he paused, his gaze shifting to the stars, "they have a chance now. And as long as we're out here, we'll keep helping. We'll find a way to reach more." Irana met his eyes, a sense of purpose rising within her. "Right," she said quietly. "We can't stop now." The next day, Dylan called a meeting of the crew and freed captives. They gathered in the main room, sitting around a large table. Dylan spoke first, his voice steady and confident. "We've done good work, saved lives, and we've made it clear that we won't stand for this. But we can't stop here. We need to keep pushing. We need to find where they're being held and stop it once and for all. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what this meant. It wasn't just about freeing a few more captives. It was about taking down the entire operation, destroying the system that allowed slavery to thrive. We'll need to be careful, Dylan continued. We don't know the full extent of their reach, but we'll start by gathering information. We'll need more allies. There are resistance groups out there, people who are already fighting back. We can't do this alone. Irina felt a surge of determination. Then we find them, she said, her voice resolute. We find the resistance, and we fight together. The crew agreed, and from that moment on, their mission changed. They would not just be rescuers. They would be rebels. They would dismantle the network of slavers, piece by piece, starting with the world they had just escaped. It would be a dangerous journey. But they all knew it was the right one. The ship charted a course for a hidden base where resistance fighters were rumored to be operating. As they traveled, Irana found herself growing more confident. She trained with the crew, learning basic self-defense and tactics. Celia, too, trained beside her. They'd both become strong in different ways, and now they were ready to use that strength to help others. As they neared the resistance base, Irana found herself reflecting on how far she had come. She had once been a prisoner, but now she was a leader. She had once been chained, but now she was free. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. She was making a difference. When the ship finally arrived at the resistance base, it was a small, unassuming station tucked away on a forgotten moon. The resistance fighters greeted them with a mix of caution and hope. They had heard of the crew's actions, but they had yet to see them in person. Dylan introduced himself and the crew. We're here to help, he said simply. We're here to fight. The leader of the resistance, a sharp-eyed woman named Lena, looked over the group. You freed some captives, she said. But that's only the beginning. We've been fighting for years. Can't afford mistakes. We can't afford to fail. Irana stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. We understand the risks, but we have the will to fight. Together, we can end this. Lena studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, we fight together. She extended her hand, and Irana took it firmly. This was the start of something bigger, something that could change the galaxy. As crew and resistance fighters began to strategize, Irana felt a new fire within her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She wasn't just fighting for the captives she had freed. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been forgotten. They had a long road ahead. But for the first time, it felt like victory was within reach.